Barbara. Now, before I begin this story, I just want to say a little bit about it. It's a story from Russia. It's rather long, but it's one of my favorites. And you might hear some words that you're unfamiliar with. For example, rubles. That's just the Russian kind of money. So think dollars when you hear rubles. And let's see, what else is there? There's Baba Yaga, and she's just an old witch, but that's the Russian version of the witch. Um, okay, let's begin with a fire sprite. Fire sprite, fair sprite, show to us your golden light. So, once upon a time, when was it? When was it truly not? There was a certain king who was very powerful, but he had no queen, for he was not married. But he had many loyal servants, and one of his most loyal servants was an archer who worked hard to bring the game to his table every day. And this archer's name was Fido, and it was one of the king's most favorite, most prized servants, shall we say. Now, one morning, early, just after dawn, Fido was out in the woods hunting game for the king's table when he saw a dove up in a tree. So he took aim and fired, but he only grazed the wing, and so the dove fell from the tree onto the ground. Fido went to pick up the dove and tear off its head and put it in its game bag, when suddenly he heard the dove speaking to him, and she said, "Oh, Master Archer, please don't tear off my rash little head and take me out of this bright world, but if you take me home and spare my life and put me on a window sill and wait until I fall asleep and then just tap me with the back of your hand, you will receive a great treasure." Well, Fido had never heard his game talking to him before, and he thought, well, she looks like a bird, but she doesn't act like a bird, she's talking. So he decided he would do what she asked. So he brought her home, he put her on the window sill, and then when she put her head under her wing, he lightly tapped her with the back of his hand, and she fell to the floor. And there Fido was just astounded, for there stood before him the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. And then she said to him, "Well, you have learned how to win me, now you must learn how to live with me, for I will be your God-given wife, and you will be my husband." And Fido was happy about that arrangement. And so they were married, and they lived together happily in Fido's little cottage. But even though he enjoyed the company of his wife, he did not forget his duties to the king. Every day he went out into the woods hunting game to supply for the king's table. And every day his wife would see him coming home tired and his boots all muddy from tromping through the mud and the water. And finally she said to him one day, "Dear husband, don't you feel a little bit worn out from this job? I think I could find you a better way to make money if you just follow my directions." And Fido thought, well, that might be a good plan. What should I do? And she said, "First off, you need to find 100 rubles." Well, Fido did not have that much money. So he went around to all his friends and got one from one friend and two from another friend, and gradually built up 100 rubles, and he brought them to his wife. And she said, "Now, take these rubles to the market, and I want you to buy me silk thread of many beautiful colors, all kinds of greens and browns and reds and blues, yellows and orange, and bring them back to me." So Fedot went to the market and bought the threads that she asked for and brought them home to her. And then his wife said, "Now, the morning is wiser than the evening. Go to bed, say your prayers, and in the morning you shall see what I have made." So Fedot went to bed, and after he was asleep his wife took out her magic book, and she opened it, and out jumped two spirits, and they bowed to her and said, "What is your wish?" And she said, "I want you to take this thread and weave it into the most beautiful tapestry imaginable. And I want you to put in all the towns and villages and rivers and lakes and forests and all the features of this kingdom. And I want you to do it in an hour." Well, after 10 minutes had passed, her two servants brought her this tapestry, and it was the finest anyone had ever seen. And so she folded her book up, and they jumped back in, and they were gone. Next morning, when Fedot woke up, she showed him the tapestry, and he was astounded. He'd never seen anything like it. She said, "Now I want you to take this to the market and sell it, but don't give a price for it. I want you to take whatever price is offered." So Fedot got his best suit on, and he put the tapestry over his arm, and he walked to the market, and he began to show it to potential buyers. And the first buyer who looked at it was overwhelmed with its beauty, and he said, "How much do you want for this?" And Fedot said, "Well, you're a skilled merchant. What do you suggest?" Well, the merchant couldn't think of any price for it. So he called some other merchants, and soon there was a whole crowd of merchants around Fedot trying to figure out what price should be put upon this beautiful tapestry. Well, the king's chief steward was in the market that day, and he saw the crowd gathering around Fedot, so he came to investigate what it was all about. And when he saw the tapestry, he knew immediately he wanted to buy that. So he asked Fedot how much he was charging. Fedot said, "My wife made this, and she told me not to charge any price for it, but to take whatever I'm offered." So the king's chief steward said, "Here, I will give you 10,000 rubles." And so the exchange was made. And Fedot went home with all these rubles to his wife, and the king's chief steward was happening to have dinner with the king that night. So he went to the king's palace, but he brought the tapestry with him. He thought he just couldn't resist showing his prized possession to the king. Well, now, when the king saw this tapestry, he took it in his hands and he held it up and he said, "Why, this is displaying all the marvels of my kingdom." "Well, my dear steward, say what you like, but you will not get this tapestry back. I'm keeping it." And he gave the steward 25,000 rubles. Well, the steward wasn't concerned because he thought, "I'll just go back to Fedot's house and get another one made." So the next day he found Fedot's poor, humble cottage, but Fedot, of course, was out hunting in the forest. So he walked right in and went into the room where Fedot's wife was sitting. And when he got into that room, and saw her, he forgot whatever he had come there for. He was just bowled over with her beauty. He couldn't even speak. He was tongue-tied. And soon he just kind of wandered away and spent his days not eating or sleeping, just dreaming about this beautiful woman he had seen. Well, the king noticed that something was wrong with his chief steward, so he asked him, "What's going on? Why are you so pale and not eating?" So the steward had to confess to him that it was this humble archer's wife that had made the tapestry, that she was so beautiful he couldn't think of anything else. Well, the king said, "I will have to go see her for myself." So he went to Fedot's house. Fedot was gone, so he walked in and walked into the room where Fedot's wife was sitting, and he too was smitten with her beauty. And he thought to himself, "Now this is a woman worthy to be my queen." So he spoke a few words with her, and then he left. And he called up his chief steward, and he said, "Well, now you have shown me this beauty, you must devise a way for me to marry her. You must find a way to get rid of her husband. And I'm commanding you to do this. If you fail me, you will lose your life." So now the king's chief steward was very troubled, and he didn't know what he was going to do. So he walked along the streets till he got to the poorer section of town, and there he ran into Baba Yaga. And she said, "Don't tell me. I know what your problem is. You are given the assignment by the king to do away with his archer Fedot. Well, this archer himself is no problem. It's his wife that's very clever. But here's my plan." And so the chief steward went back to the king, all excited with this plan that he had heard from Baba Yaga. And then he told it to the king. And the king was like, "Yes, that should work." So the king called for his servants and had them find the most ramshackle, run-down ship that in their whole kingdom, and to bring it to port. And then he had other servants go out and find the most uh, ragtag crew to run this ship. And they were to go to the bars and find all the drunks and the alleyways and find sailors who could barely walk. And so he outfitted a ship and had the crew there. And then he called in Fedot. And he said, "My dear archer, you are one of my best servants. So I have decided on a mission for you. I would like you to go through the thrice ninth kingdom to the thrice 10th kingdom to an island in the middle of the ocean. And there is a stag with golden antlers. I want you to sail there. It'll take you 3 years, capture the stag, and then sail back. And I have a ship all ready for you." And Fedot's jaw dropped, and he was about to open his mouth when the king said, "Like it or not, if you do not obey my will, by my sword your head will roll." So Fedot didn't say a word, but he left the palace, feeling very glum indeed. So he got home, and he wasn't saying anything, and he was just eating his supper sadly, and his wife finally asked him what was wrong. And he said, "The king has sent me on an impossible errand. I'm to go past the thrice ninth kingdom to the thrice 10th kingdom to an island in the middle of the ocean, and capture a stag with golden antlers and bring it back." And then his wife said, "Oh, don't worry. Things are not always as hard as they seem. The morning is always wiser than the evening. Go to bed, say your prayers, and wake up and see how we can solve this problem." So Fido went to sleep, and his wife went to her magic book and opened it up, and her two spirits came out, and she said, "I want you to go to the thrice ninth kingdom, to the thrice 10th kingdom, to the island in the middle of the ocean, and bring back the stag with the golden antlers. And I need you to do it before nightfall is over." So away they went, and before long, halfway through the night, they came back with the stag with the golden antlers. So the next morning, Fido woke up, and his wife showed him that he had the prize already. Now he just had to fool the king. So he built a big box, put the stag in there, locked it up, and had it carried down to the ship yard, and all the people were gathered there to see him off, and the king waved goodbye, and they all wanted to know what the big box was, and Fido said, "Oh, it's just supplies for the voyage." So they helped him load it on the ship, and away they went. And the king said to his steward, "Ah, now my problem is solved, because after a few days that ship will just sink to the bottom of the ocean, and he'll never find his way back anyway." Well, Fido on the ship sailed for about 3 days, and then he brought out a big barrel of beer and told the sailors, "Here, you can tap this barrel and drink as much as you like." Well, they were happy about that arrangement, and soon they were all sound asleep. And so Fido steered the ship, turned it around, and headed it back to shore. And any time the sailors woke up, he brought out another barrel of beer, and back to sleep they went, until he arrived safely in the shore. And all the news went through the town that Fido had returned. So the king came storming down to the shore and said, "What are you doing back here? You were sent on a mission." And Fido said, "Well, some people would take a long time to do that mission, but I have fulfilled it already." And he brought out the stag with the golden antlers. Now the king couldn't say another word. So he took the stag and went back to his palace, and Fido went home to his wife. But the king called his chief steward and said, "Well, your little plan did not work. Now I want you to go and find another way to get rid of that archer. And if you don't, your life will be at stake." Oh, so the chief steward went back to Baba Yaga and told her the sad story that he brought back the golden stag in like a week. So she said, "Yes, he's no problem, but his wife is very clever. But I have something that neither one of them will ever be able to solve. You tell the king." And then she told him the plan. So he went back to the king with a big smile, and he said, "O king, all you have to do is send him on a mission to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what." "Ah," thought the king, "that sounds ingenious. Yes." So he called in the archer, and he said, "You know, you did such a good job for me, bringing back that stag with the golden antlers, that I'm sending you on another mission. I want you to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what." and like it or not, if you do not obey my will, by my sword your head will roll." So there was nothing for it. Fido had to go home in deep sorrow, his head hanging low. It took a long time for his wife to get out of him what the problem was. Finally he said, "I get out of one mess and then another one comes along, and it's all because of your great beauty." And she said, "What is it?" And he said, "I'm to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what." "Ah," said his wife, "yes, that is a challenge. But morning is wiser than the evening. You go to bed, say your prayers, and we'll see what happens in the morning." So Fido went to bed, and his wife got out her big magic book and opened it up, and out came the two spirits, and she said, "I want you to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what." And they looked at her, and then they said, "I'm sorry. We're sorry, mistress, but that's not anything in our realm of possibility." So she closed the book. They went back in. Next morning Fido woke up, and she said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you that this trip is going to take you about 18 years. And so, but I want you to go to the king and ask him for a lot of gold because you're going to need it. And then I want you to take this ball, and after you get outside the village, throw it on the ground and follow it wherever it leads you. And I also want you to take this handkerchief that I embroidered, and whenever you wash your face and want to wipe your face, only use this handkerchief." She folded it up, and he put it in his pocket, and he took the ball, and then he went to the king and asked for his bag of gold, and the king was happy to give it to him, and then he went on his way. When he got outside the village, he threw the ball down, and he followed it wherever it led. Meanwhile, the king decided that was a done deal, he'd never come back, so he had Fido's wife brought to the palace, and he said to her, "You are so beautiful, you are so fine, you don't need to be in a poor cottage like that, you should be living in a palace like this. You are fine enough to be a queen, and I am offering my hand to marry you." And Fido's wife said, "Well, since when has it ever been heard under the bright sun for a man to ask another man's wife to marry him when that other man is still alive?" Now the king was very angry, and he said, "If you won't marry me by your free will, I will force you." So Fido's wife gave a sweet smile, and then she tapped her foot on the ground, and she turned into a dove and flew out the window. Meanwhile Fido was traveling, following that ball wherever it rolled. Whether a long time or a short time, speedily a tale is spun, but a lot longer is the deed done. But at last, one evening, just at dusk, he came to this castle, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and he knocked on the door. The door opened, and three beautiful maidens answered the door, as beautiful as his own wife. And they brought him in, and they said, "Who are you, and where are you going?" And he said, "Oh, is it customary to ask a gentleman or traveler all these questions before you've fed him or given him a nice place to sleep?" So they brought a fine meal to him and let him eat his heart's content, and then they showed him a wonderful bedroom, and he slept a good night's sleep. Next morning they brought in a pitcher of water and a bowl for him to wash his face, and after he washed his face they handed him a beautiful embroidered towel. But Fido said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't use that." And he took out the cloth that his wife had given him, and he began to wipe his face. And the maiden said, "Where did you get that cloth?" And he said, "Oh, my wife made it for me." And they said, "Oh, that's our sister. We have to tell our mother." And so they ran to get their mother, and in came this old woman, and she was so happy to meet her son-in-law. And she asked him what his mission was, and he told her, "I'm to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what." "Oh, that's a tough one," she said. "Maybe some of my servants will know." So she took him outside, and she clapped her hands and called all the animals and birds of the earth to come to her. And they all gathered round. And she said, "In your travels to and fro, have you ever found out how to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what?" And they all looked at each other and shook their heads and said, "No, never in our travels have we heard of such a thing." So she brought Fido in the house, and she said, "Well, maybe all my servants of the ocean will know." So she clapped her hands, and two giants stood before her. And one took Fido, and one took the old woman, and they walked out into the middle of the ocean and stood there like two pillars. And she called all the fish of the sea, and they came out, all up, perking up above the water. And she said, "Have any of you in all your travels learned how to go I know not whither, and bring back I know not what?" And they all shook their heads and said, "No, we've never heard of such a thing." But there was one old frog kind of limping over on the water, and she said, she had come late, but she said, "I think I heard what you said, and long ago, 30 years ago, I heard of such a thing. But it's far, far away, farther than I could ever travel. I'm so old." And the old woman said, "Ah, you are the one to help us." And so she took the frog, and the giants took her and Fido back to the castle, and she sat the frog down and said, "We will find a way for you to travel." And she got a big jar of milk and put the frog in there, who loved lapping the milk. And she gave the jar to Fido, and she said, "Now, I want you to carry this jar in front of you and go the wherever the frog tells you to go. That's where you must go." So Fido did that, and he traveled and he traveled and he traveled until at last they came to the river of fire. And across that river was a mountain, and in that mountain was a door. And then the old frog said, "Take me out and put me on the shore, and then sit on me. Don't worry, you won't crush me." So Fido sat on the frog, and he felt like he was going to crush it, but suddenly the frog began swelling up, bigger and bigger and bigger, until Fido was worrying about how he could hold on. And the frog was so big, and then it suddenly jumped right over the fiery river. When it got to the other side, it shrunk down again, and it said, "Now, Fido, go to that mountain over there, and you'll find a door. Go in the door and make your way through the dark tunnel, and you'll come to a room, and there hide and observe and do whatever you think is best." So Fido traveled over to the mountain, and there he found the door. He opened the door and went in. It was very dark, he had to grope his way to find this room at the end. But there was a cupboard, so he hid in the cupboard and peeked through a crack. And in time, two old men came in, and they clapped their hands and said, "Eh, Shmat Razum, bring us a feast." And suddenly a table appeared with a candlestick on it, and all kinds of dishes of food and glasses of wonderful drinks. And the two men sat down and ate and feasted away. And then they said, "Hey, Shmat Razum, take everything away." And everything disappeared by magic. And then the two old men left. So Fido came out of his cupboard and he called out, "Hey, Shmat Razum, spread me a feast." And sure enough, a table appeared with all kinds of food and dishes and drinks. And there was a chair. He sat down, and there was another chair. And he said, "Hey, Shmat Razum, brother, come sit with me and dine with me. I'm not used to dining alone." And this voice from nowhere said, "Who? What kind of person is this? I've been working 30 years serving those two old men, and they've never once asked me to dine with them." And then the Fido could see the food magically disappearing off the plate on the other side of the table, and the wine glasses being tipped up, and the drink disappearing. So after he was full, he said, "Hey, Shmat Razum, after you clear everything away, why don't you come with me? You would you would have a lot of fun, and I'd be good company." And he heard this voice saying, "You know, I think I will. It's been getting pretty boring here, and you seem like a good, kind master. I will be your servant." And so Fido went back uh, out the door of the mountain, and he was walking away, and he said, "Hey, Shmat Razum, are you there?" And he heard a voice say, "I'm right here, master. Don't worry. I'll be with you all the way." So he went back to where the frog was waiting, sat on the frog, and she swelled up again and jumped over the river of fire, and then they traveled back to the castle. And Fido had Shmat Razum spread a fine feast for his mother-in-law and his three sister-in-laws, and they had a great time. And then it was time to go back home. But poor Fido, he was walking until his limbs were ready to fall off and his arms were hanging, and he said, "Oh, Shmat Razum, you should only know how tired I am." And the voice said, "Oh, why didn't you tell me? I can get you there in a wink." And suddenly Fido felt himself being picked up and whistling by in the wind. And he said, "Wait, Shmat Razum, my hat blew off. Let me get my hat." And Shmat Razum said, "Oh my goodness, that's 5,000 miles behind us now." So they were traveling very fast. And as they were going over the ocean, Shmat Razum said to Fido, "How would you like to have a golden arbor here in the middle of the ocean where you could rest and enjoy yourself and maybe make a little money or get some treasures?" Fido said, "Sure, why not?" So suddenly, where there was no island, there was an island, and there was this beautiful golden arbor on that island. And Fido was got a nice place to sit under there and was relaxing. Meanwhile, these three merchant ships were going by, and they called to each other, "Hey, have you ever seen that island before?" They said, "No. Let's go look at that beautiful golden arbor. Let's go see what it is." So They came up and found Fido sitting there under the arbor, and they joined him, and they said, "Wow, what are you doing here?" And Fido said, "Would you like to have a feast? I can spread a feast for you." And they said, "Really?" He said, "Sure." He said, "Hey, Shmat Razum, spread the table." And suddenly there was all this wonderful food and drink, and the three merchants were delighted. And they looked at each other and they said, "Could we trade you for this fine servant of yours?" And Fido said, "Well, what do you have?" For Shmat Razum had told him that he could trade anything, but he would come back. So they showed one man pulled out a box from his vest, and he said, "Watch this." And he opened the box, and suddenly there was this beautiful garden everywhere with paths and fountains and trees growing. And then when he closed the box, it all went back in like it was never there. That was a marvel indeed. But then the other merchant took an axe out from under his coat, and he went tap, tap, and suddenly there was a ship all built. Tap, 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 tap. He did that 100 times, and there were 100 ships with captains coming and ready, saluting him and asking for his orders and ready to fire the cannons. And then he put the axe back under his vest, and all the ships were gone like they had never been there. The third man brought out a horn, and when he blew in one end of it, cavalry and infantry appeared, and the generals were coming to him asking for orders, and cannons were shooting, and bugles were blaring, and they were ready to march and fight. But when he blew the other end, they all went back, and they were gone. And Fido said, "Oh, I'm a humble man, these are things like for a king. I don't really think I'd have any need for these things. Tell you what, I'll trade you my servant for all three of them." And they said, "Wow, that's a pretty steep bargain there." Then they talked amongst each other and they said, "Look, once we have that servant, we won't have any need for anything else. We can just lay around and eat and drink our lives away." So they made the bargain, and Shmat Razum went with them, and they went on their ships, and they got back and all gathered their ships together and had Shmat Razum feed all their um, all their servants and sailors, and oh, they were just delighted with their trade. Meanwhile, back on the island, Fido was looking at all his treasures, and he was thinking, "Gee, I miss Shmat Razum." And suddenly, there he was. He heard his voice saying, "I'm here, master. Let's go." And so they went flying back to his kingdom, and the poor merchants were bereft of their great treasure, and they were pretty sad. But when they got back to Fido's kingdom, right on the beach he saw a nice big bare place, and he said, "Why don't we build a castle here?" And Shmat Razum said, "No problem." And in no time at all, there was this beautiful castle, twice as big and beautiful as the king's. And then the king, and then Fido took that box out of his vest and he opened it up, and there were gardens and fountains and pools all spread out in his castle, and trees and flowers. And then he was sitting in his castle when a dove came in the window, and she stamped her foot, and it was his wife. And oh, there was such a hugging and kissing, and they were so happy to see each other. And each one had to tell the other all their adventures, and she told how she was just flying around the forest as a blue dove. Meanwhile, the king was looking out his window and wondering what that castle was doing there. and who had the nerve to build a castle in his kingdom without asking him? So he inquired, and then when he found out that it was Fido and his wife was there living happily with him, he was angry. So he called his generals, and he called out his armies and his infantry and his cavalry, and they began marching. He at the head of the army, marching, and he said, I want you to burn down that castle and kill that Fido and his wife and wipe them off the earth. And so Fido saw this army approaching. And so he took out the axe and went tap, 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 tap until he had 100 ships. And they were all blowing their shooting their cannons and attacking the army. And then he took out his bugle and blew it, and there was his infantry and his cavalry asking for orders, and he sent them off to fight the king's army. And so in no time at all, they had captured all the king's men, and the king himself had been killed. So all the people of the land came to Fido and said, Would you be our king? And he said yes, and his beautiful wife was the queen, and they ruled happily and wisely. And that's my story. Thank you for listening.